Hello, everyone. I'm Olympia. Thank you for being here with me in this wonderful place called Lights Out Library, and I have a great story to tell you. The Aeneid, the Roman equivalent to the Iliad and Odyssey, is an extraordinary long story that will take us from the ruins of Troy, conquered and destroyed by the Greeks, to the foundation of antiquity's greatest empire by a group of Trojan fugitives led by Aeneas. There will be adventure, love, God's interventions, fights, prophecies, and even a journey to the Underworld. I will also tell you about the author of the Aeneid, the structure and posterity of this work, as well as its cultural and political significance. But let's begin immediately with the first chapter of our story, one that will take us to Troy, at the moment when the Trojans thought they had won their 10-year-long war against the Greeks. But in reality, they were in great danger of losing everything. You know the Trojan War, as it was told in the Iliad and the Odyssey. All the kings and cities from Greece, the Achaeans gathered to attack the powerful city of Troy on the other side of the Aegean Sea. But Troy was well protected behind its walls, defended by heroes and even supported by some gods like Poseidon, which is Neptune to the Romans, Aphrodite, which is Venus to the Romans, and Apollo. The Trojans resisted. It seemed the city would never fall, as the Greeks could not breach its fortifications, and the attackers were losing patience, threatening their coalition after 10 years of fruitless attacks on Troy, until King Odysseus, Ulysses, came up with a plan. The Greeks built a large wooden statue of a horse on wheels, and suddenly, overnight, they abandoned the beach under the city's walls, or so it seemed. Only one man, Sinon, one of their warriors, stayed on the beach, as the Greeks pretended to sail away. His mission was to convince the Trojans that the Achaeans had abandoned the fight and that they had won the war. He also claimed that the horse was an offering to Neptune, the god of the seas and the master of horses. But this was obviously a trap. The horse was anything but empty. Inside it were King Ulysses and a group of warriors, hidden, waiting for the Trojans to drag the horse behind their walls. The Trojans hesitated. The Greeks were nowhere to be seen, and what risk was there to accept a wooden statue, a gift to one of their protector gods? Sinon convinced them that accepting it would grant them favors from Neptune, and they would be able to conquer Greece if they did. But after 10 years of merciless war, Trojans had their doubts, especially a priest of Apollo named Laocoon, who saw through the Greek plot and urged his compatriots to destroy the horse immediately. As he was hurling his spear at the horse, 2 serpents sent by the gods suddenly emerged from the sea and devoured him. As the Trojans saw as a punishment for disrespecting the offering to Neptune. In fact, the gods had sent the snakes, but not to help the Trojans. They had decided that Troy should fall, and it required a Greek plot to succeed. Impressed by this divine intervention, the Trojans dragged the statue behind their fortified walls, and they began to organize festivities to celebrate their victory. After nightfall, as the Trojans were oblivious to threats, as they thought nothing could happen behind their walls, the armed Greeks emerged from the wooden statue where they had remained hidden all day and opened the city's gates in silence. The Greek army had returned and now stood ready to enter the defenseless city. As these events were unfolding, one of the Trojan princes and heroes, Aeneas, was sleeping at his house. Aeneas, who was of the highest Trojan nobility. His father, Anchises, was a prince of Troy, and his mother was the goddess Venus herself, who always loved and protected her son. Aeneas had fought bravely throughout the war and, protected by his fighting skills and his godly mother, he had survived. That night, as the Greeks began to invade the city and slaughter the Trojan guards, the Trojan hero Hector, who had recently been killed by Greece's most formidable hero, Achilles, appeared to him in a dream. Hector's ghost urged Aeneas to immediately flee the city with his family. The gods had made plans, as they were used to, and they had decided that Troy would fall. But in the negotiations between them, Venus had obtained protection and a future for her son, a future so brilliant and extraordinary that the name of Aeneas would remain immortal, and his deeds would be celebrated for centuries alongside those of Hector, Ulysses, and Hercules. But for this fate to happen, Aeneas needed to escape the destruction of the city. At first, he refused and tried to fight the enemy, but the cause was lost, and Trojan warriors were falling, one after another, as more and more columns of fire and smoke rose from the city. Aeneas witnessed the murder of Priam, the old king of Troy, by Epirus, the son of Achilles, and he accepted that the war was lost. Ulysses' plan had worked, and trickery had defeated honor. Venus appeared to her son and led him back to his house, where his son, Ascanius, his wife, Creusa, and his father, Anchises, were anxiously awaiting. They all agreed to try to escape, and discreetly took the direction of the city's gates through the chaos that Troy had become. When they reached the open gates, Aeneas realized that Creusa was no longer with them, and he went back into the city to look for her. But he only encountered her ghost and understood that she had perished. The ghost of his wife, inspired by the gods, told him that he should follow his destiny. He would travel to Hesperia, to a western land, go through struggles, temptation, and perils, but ultimately kingship and a new royal spouse awaited him there. Desperate, almost broken by the cruelty of life and the gods, Aeneas was close to renouncing his own life after losing his city and his wife. But his son had survived, and his father too, and with inspiration from his divine mother, he found the strength to rally a few other survivors and flee from the burning city. the world was ending. The Greeks were now celebrating their triumph, but the survival of Aeneas and his companions were the seeds of a new empire, one that, by the will of the gods, would surpass anything the Trojans or even the Greeks could have imagined. In many generations, the creation of Rome and its extraordinary destiny would be the phoenix rising from the ashes of Troy. As always, you do not need to watch the video to follow along. If you wish to, you may close your eyes and forget about any worries as we embark on this adventure together. If you are so kind, please subscribe to my channel and click on the like button. This does help support the channel and limits ads as much as possible so that they don't interrupt you. Please also follow us on Facebook for announcements. If you fall asleep and wish to return to the video later or simply jump directly to a particular part of the story, timestamps are listed in the description and they are also pinned in the first comment. Also in the description and in the first comment, you will find links to different streaming options like Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Music. That may work better for you. As Aeneas and his companions get ready to embark on a long adventure, take a long, deep, relaxing breath. When you exhale, release the tension in your shoulders, your neck, release the tension in your facial muscles too, and allow the sound of my voice to guide you through this journey. So now let's resume our journey with Aeneas and follow him all the way to Italy on his adventurous wanderings. After their escape from Troy, the survivors hastily built a fleet of ships and decided to accompany their new leader Aeneas on his travels to the western land. Even though they were a small group of refugees, the gods looked upon them with varying degrees of favor. On their side were the protectors of Troy, like Neptune, Venus, and Apollo. Others were neutral, maybe even hostile, like Juno, Hera to the Greeks, the queen of gods and wife of Jupiter, Zeus, or Minerva, Athena to the Greeks, traditional protector of Greek heroes such as Ulysses. Under the eyes of the gods, the expedition began its wanderings across the Aegean and Mediterranean seas. To begin with, they landed in Thrace, near Troy, where they found the last remains of another Trojan warrior and hero, Polydorus. Then, on the island of Delos, a holy sanctuary of Apollo, and his twin sister Diana, the patron goddess of hunters. Delos was welcoming and peaceful. The group was tempted to stay there after the exhausting ordeal they had undergone in Troy. But Apollo told them to leave, as it was not the place the gods intended for them to colonize. So they resumed their journey and sailed south to Crete, where they believed they had arrived at their destination. They began building a settlement, the future city. But as soon as they began to build, they were struck with disease. Apollo appeared to Aeneas in a dream and told him that this was the wrong place. This was not the western land of Italy, and they should leave Crete immediately to resume their journey. Left with no other choice, They abandoned the settlement and sailed away from Crete to the west. On their next stop, in small islands of west of Greece, they met Harpy, a monster half bird and half woman that occasionally feasted on human flesh, but also wise enough to avoid attacking the protege of Venus. She ordered them to leave her island immediately and made a prophecy for Aeneas. They would reach Italy one day in the future, but they wouldn't find it until hunger forced them to eat their own tables. With this gloomy prophecy, they resumed their wanderings, this time landing in Epirus, north of Greece. They were not the only survivors of Troy. Others had managed to escape and travel to Epirus, in today's northern Greece and Albania. There, another group of survivors from Troy had begun to build a city that replicated Troy, and they hoped that this city would give them a second home and cure their homesickness. In Epirus, Aeneas met Andromache, the widow of Hector. Andromache had also escaped Troy and was still mourning the loss of her husband and their son. She had suffered as much or even more than most of the Trojans in the war. But despite all the pain, she had remained a model of fidelity and virtue. She was accompanied by Helenus, the son of King Priam of Troy, who had the gift of prophecy. And yet again a prophecy was made. Helenus revealed that not only would Aeneas's descendants prosper in Italy, but they would also rule the entire world. Epirus was still not the promised land for them, and the group resumed their journey. As I mentioned before, not all gods who watched Aeneas's expedition were benevolent. Among their enemies was Juno, who is Hera in the Iliad and the Greek mythology, the wife of Jupiter. Juno was against the Trojans and Venus because she had been humiliated. Long before the Trojan War, three goddesses had appeared in front of Prince Paris of Troy and competed for his preference. And at that moment, the chain of events that later led to the complete destruction of Troy had begun. Paris had been tasked to choose which of the three goddesses should receive a golden apple, gifted by the goddess of discord. This was a poisonous gift. The apple had been gifted to no one in particular. It came with just the instruction that it should be the property of the most deserving goddess, and three of them considered it should be theirs: Juno, Minerva, and Venus. Paris had to choose between them, and to seduce or convince him, each goddess promised extraordinary rewards: kingship and power from Juno, strength and glory from Minerva, or the love of the most beautiful woman in the world from Venus. Paris had chosen Venus over the other two because the highest reward a man could hope for was eternal and perfect love. And so he had been promised Helen, the Greek queen, whom he took to Troy, prompting the beginning of the war. Venus had sided with the Trojans, whereas Juno and Minerva were on the Greek side for these reasons. To most, the death of Paris and the complete destruction of Troy would have been enough for her vengeance. but not for Juno, who was able to hold grudges for a very long time and had never been very good at forgiving anything, from the judgment of Paris to the infidelities of her husband. And so, after all these years, Juno was still harboring anger and jealousy towards Venus and kept plotting against the Trojans. Another reason to stop them that appeared when the gods had accepted that Aeneas and his companions would travel westward and lay the foundations of Rome is that it was said that one day Rome would be the rival and destroyer of the city of Carthage, Juno's favorite city, and for that reason she viewed the prophecies in favor of Aeneas with even more displeasure. And so she had decided they would never reach Italy, never found a new city, and she would get her true revenge against Venus. The moment for her to strike was approaching. The expedition had come close to Italy, but wasn't there yet. They were approaching Sicily, the large island to the south of Italy. There they went through other adventures near Sicily, like Ulysses. Nearly at the same time, even, they were caught in the whirlpool of Charybdis, a particularly dangerous place where boats were taken in a strait between an immensely powerful whirlpool. Charybdis and a sea monster, Scylla. As a result, they were driven out to sea and traveled away from Italy, only to come ashore at the land of the Cyclops, giant one-eyed creatures that were as stupid and mean as they were strong. They narrowly escaped Polyphemus, a Cyclops that Ulysses had wounded and tricked shortly before his own trip back to his kingdom. And after that, Aeneas's father, Anchises, died of old age, and the fleet was suddenly taken into an unexpected storm. Juno had chosen this moment to finally unleash her wrath. Juno had no power over the seas and the winds, and so she had approached Aeolus, the king of the winds, and asked that he release the winds to stir up a storm. Aeolus had no reason to obey her and take sides between the gods, so she had to offer him a bribe. Juno reigned over several lovely sea nymphs and offered the loveliest of them as a wife to Aeolus. The king of the winds found the price sufficient and accepted the offer. Soon the fleet of Aeneas that was trying to sail back toward Italy saw black clouds form above their heads. Winds began to blow chaotically from every direction. The storm devastated and scattered the fleet. The Trojans were saved only by the intervention of Neptune. The god of the seas had been infuriated by Juno's intrusion into his domain, and he calmed the waters to save the desperate fleet from sinking. The ships could regroup and take shelter on the coast of Africa, near a recently founded city where a powerful queen reigned. The city was Carthage, and its queen was called Dido. You'll remember that prophecies had been made. Carthage would later become a great imperial rival and enemy to Rome. But who could have believed that when Carthage had just been founded by a group of Phoenicians who had created this settlement far from their homeland in the east of the Mediterranean Sea. And Rome did not even exist. After a while, as the crews were repairing the ships and looking for food, Aeneas decided to venture into the city of Carthage. He knew that Juno was the patroness of Carthage. She had a temple there, and he hoped he could appease her by showing his devotion. In the temple of Juno, he met for the first time the queen of Carthage, the lovely Dido. And at first sight, he liked her, if not more, and sought her favors. The memory of Creusa, his lost wife from Troy, had not entirely faded yet. But after so much loneliness, the beauty and grace of Dido had awakened a flame in him, which he thought had entirely disappeared forever. Dido was a widow too, and she was not insensitive to the looks and bravery of the Trojan warrior. Venus knew that the expedition needed respite before resuming its journey, and what better protection and help than the Queen of Carthage's? So she once again called her son Cupid, the little god who could inspire love in humans, like she had called him years before to make Helen fall for Paris. Cupid, taking the appearance of Ascanius, the son of Aeneas, who was part of the expedition, went to Dido with gifts. Dido responded with a banquet given in honor of her Trojan visitors. During the banquet, Cupid secretly inspired fresh love for Aeneas in the heart of Dido. The threads of a tragedy were coming together. The two were attracted to each other, but separated by prophecies that pitted the young Carthage against the future Rome. How would the other gods react to this impossible love? We will see soon how events unfolded. Before we delve into the Aeneid and its author, Virgil, let's understand what this work is about. It was written over a 10-year period at the turn of our era between 29 and 19 BC, a time when Rome had already begun its impressive expansion as a military, cultural, and political power. Politically, there was also a transition from the old republic to an increasingly imperial system. Although the institutions of the ancient Greece Republic officially remained in place, supreme power was shifting into the hands of hereditary emperors. When the Aeneid was written, the new emperor was Augustus, successor of Julius Caesar, the one who defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra, and all of his other rivals too, to concentrate all power in his hands. Years of civil war, the fall of the Republic in all but name, and the devastation this had caused had torn through society. People were craving stability, and perhaps their faith in the greatness of Rome had been severely shaken, eroded. Rome was no stranger to civil wars, but its republican tradition was very ancient and historically successful. Augustus was well aware of the need to consolidate his power and restore pride in traditional Roman values as a way of providing a sense of continuity and political unity, of course. The Aeneid was written and sponsored by the highest authorities in Rome. With all that in mind, it was not the only reason. It is a work in its own right, but from the start it was seen as serving a purpose. In part, it was propaganda, even though the premise is that it tells the story of the founding of Rome. It was never presented as a history book at all. The Romans were well aware that it was a myth being forged, fabricated. Yet this does not mean it was ineffective. By turning a hero with high moral values into the founder of Rome, and even linking him to the ruling dynasty, the Julio-Claudian dynasty, we will see that later, Virgil hoped to create a remarkable work, but also to galvanize his readers, to re-inject a sense of greatness, of epic, of duration into the mythology of Rome. A well-known and actually older story about the founding of Rome is that of Romulus and Remus, and Virgil does not eliminate them. He integrates this tale into the epic, together with numerous pre-existing characters and stories from the Greek and Roman traditions, because obviously Greek culture was very important to the Romans, not just in literature with works like the Iliad and the Odyssey, which they knew perfectly, but also in religion, architecture, language, logic, philosophy, and their way of looking at the world. All of this was well known and part of the cultural baggage of educated Roman citizens. They had ambivalent feelings towards Greece. There was a great deal of admiration for and acceptance of this cultural heritage, but also a sense of being different and somewhat more successful as a civilization. It was Rome, not Greece, that had conquered the entire Mediterranean world. At the end of the 1st century BC, pretty much all of the ancient Greek world and a large part of the empire of Alexander the Great were already under Roman administration. The Aeneid reflects all this. It is clearly strongly inspired by Homer's works, full of references to Greece, and yet the ancestors of the Romans in the story are Trojans, the enemies of the Greeks, who finally got their revenge many centuries later. This was a characteristic of the Romans. They often glorified their enemies, the kingdoms they conquered, because doing so only improved their own sense of greatness. They did it with Carthage and all of their successive opponents along their expansion. But the Aeneid is more than a propaganda work. It is a massive piece of storytelling and poetry, comprising almost 10,000 lines. Even though today it is somewhat less famous than the Iliad and the Odyssey, and you don't see as many movies or TV shows directly inspired by the Aeneid. Nor are the characters as famous, but this was not the case always. Until the modern period, the Aeneid was at the center of scholarly culture and was seen as a masterpiece of antique literature. In the Middle Ages and the early modern times, it was probably the most important original work in Latin. It was to Latin what Homer's Odyssey was to Greek. The story itself was well known and taught to students until the 19th century. Elements from antiquity were reintegrated into Western culture over the centuries in novels and plays or operas, and the Aeneid continued to be retold through these forms. In operas, one of the most famous pieces by Henry Purcell, the English Baroque composer, is Dido and Aeneas. Additionally, there is a 19th century opera by Hector Berlioz called The Trojans, which retells the story of the Aeneid. Now, the chronology of the work is not exactly as I'm telling it. Another thing that Virgil took from the Greeks, from Homer, is the structure. It is not chronological but begins in medias res, in the middle of events in Latin. Then we learn of past events through flashbacks, when characters tell their stories to others, as in the Odyssey. The Odyssey begins near the end, when Ulysses' son, Telemachus, is looking for information about what happened to his father, since he left the siege of Troy years before. Then we learned what happened to him until the end, when it returns to the present, when Ulysses reconquers his kingdom and his wife. This narrative technique makes the story more dynamic, and when it was told rather than read in antiquity, it must have been even more captivating for the audience. However, an unfortunate consequence is that when you read the Odyssey today, you have to start with arguably the least interesting part, at least in terms of entertainment value, which may have led many generations of readers to abandon the book before reaching the most entertaining parts. In the Aeneid, Virgil rectifies this by starting at the point where Aeneas and his ships are caught in a storm created by Juno, who indirectly asks Aeolus to send the winds for her. We are immediately thrown into the middle of the action, and then the Trojans land for repairs on the coast of Africa, near Carthage. Here, Aeneas meets Dido, and he tells her everything that has happened to them since their escape from Troy. This is how we learn everything I've just told you. After that, the story becomes linear again, and we follow Aeneas from Carthage to Italy and the struggle to lay the foundation of Rome. There are 12 chapters or books in total in the Aeneid, and we have only gone through 3 of them. So let's resume the story because there is still a lot to discover. Dido and Aeneas had fallen in love in Carthage, and Juno saw the opportunity to strike a deal with Venus. She would leave Aeneas alone if he could stay with Dido. This way he would be distracted from his destiny of founding the city in Italy, and Rome would never exist, never rise, so that her city, Carthage, would not be destroyed. Venus was inclined to accept because she cared for the happiness of her son. He had already suffered so much since the fall of Troy, and she was willing to give him some respite, at least. The Trojans liked their stay in Carthage. They were ready to go, but they stayed to enjoy Dido's hospitality, and their leader showed no hurry to leave. One day, on a hunting expedition, a storm drove Aeneas and Dido to a covered grove, where they made love for the first time. Both were so happy to have found each other that they desired nothing else than to get married and spend the rest of their days together. Venus and Juno observed this with satisfaction, but the other gods were displeased to see Aeneas had forgotten the destiny they had decided for him. So Jupiter sent his messenger, Mercury, to remind the Trojan prince of his duty. Our hero was faced with a tragic dilemma. Fulfilling his duty would be at the cost of his happiness and the happiness of the woman he loved. He hesitated, but Aeneas was not one to reject the call of duty or go against the gods. Unable to face his lover, he left clandestinely at night. His heart was broken by the decision. Dido's heart was equally broken when she discovered this, and life had lost all appeal to her. She committed suicide by impaling herself upon a pyre with Aeneas's sword. Her last words were to predict eternal strife between Aeneas's people and hers. And so, in the flames of the pyre where her body was turning to ashes, another prophecy began to be fulfilled. Rome and Carthage would forever be arch enemies, and only the destruction of Carthage would end this rivalry. Once again, men would be toys in the hands of the gods. But Aeneas had chosen duty over personal interest and had proven worthy of the destiny he had been assigned. The journey resumed. They sailed north and returned to Sicily. Not far from where the stone sent by Aeolus on request of June had scattered their fleet months earlier. It was time to remember Anchises, Aeneas's father, and funeral games were organized for the anniversary of his death. As the men were busy with sports competitions, Juno was still plotting. Her agreement with Venus had ended when Aeneas left Carthage and Dido, and now she would do anything she could to stop Aeneas from reaching Italy and founding Rome. She sent her messenger Iris, disguised as an old woman, to convince the Trojan women from the expedition to burn the fleet and thus prevent the Trojans from ever reaching Italy. But when Aeneas saw that his ships were burning, he fell to his knees and prayed to Jupiter to quench the fires. The king of gods accepted and sent a rainstorm to save the fleet from complete destruction. But the gods don't do anything for free. In return for saving the fleet and for safe passage to Italy, Jupiter demanded one of Aeneas's men to be sacrificed to him. Shortly after, the helmsman of Aeneas's ship was claimed as the prize. He was put to sleep at night by the god of sleep, Somnus, and fell overboard. Jupiter had claimed his life. Before this, Aeneas had received a vision of his father, who had instructed him to go to the Underworld, where he would receive a vision of his future and Rome's future. Protected by Jupiter, the fleet finally landed in Italy near Cuma, the city close to what would later be Naples. In this small city resided a powerful prophetess, the Sibyl, who presided over the oracle of Apollo. She could see glimpses of the future, knew the ways of the gods, and she could travel to the underworld. Aeneas asked for guidance on the journey to the underworld he had to accomplish, and together they descended to the land of the dead. First, they passed by crowds of the dead by the banks of the river Acheron. To continue their journey, the dead had to pay Charon, the ferryman, to access the other bank. The ones who couldn't pay him had to wait 1,000 years of loneliness and boredom before he would let them cross. But the Sibyl knew these lands and paid Charon so they could swiftly cross and pass in front of Cerberus, the giant three-headed hound that guarded the underworld. Few living ever visited the underworld, and even fewer returned. But Aeneas had this privilege. First, he could see Tartarus, where the wicked are kept prisoners and suffer for eternity. The Sibyl warned him to always bow to the justice of the gods if he didn't want to end there. Aeneas was glad he had abandoned Carthage and followed the orders of the gods until then. Then he was brought to the green fields of Elysium, where those who are worthy can spend an eternity of joy and peace. He was happy to find the spirit of his father, Anchises, there, and he was offered a prophetic vision of the destiny of Rome, not just a city, not just a kingdom, but a universal empire destined to cover the entire world. After this, Aeneas and the Sibyl returned to the world of the living. Aeneas had found inspiration in the underworld. His expedition had reached Italy, and now it was time to found this new city that the gods had envisioned. Upon returning to our world, Aeneas led the Trojans to the north, to the region of Latium, where he decided they would settle. However, the region was not uninhabited. It was dominated by the kingdom of the Latins, ruled by King Latinus, who had a daughter named Lavinia. Lavinia had been promised to Turnus, the ruler of another native people, the Rutuli. But before the Trojans' arrival in Latium, an oracle had foreseen the arrival of foreigners and had instructed Latinus to marry his daughter to one of the newcomers, not to Turnus. The gods had made preparations to facilitate the settlement of the Trojans, but Juno was watching with discontent at the Trojans' favorable fortunes. Aeneas was on the cusp of fulfilling his mission peacefully, so Juno summoned the Fury, the deity of vengeance, from the underworld to incite war between the Trojans and the locals. The Fury provoked the queen of Latium, wife of Latinus, to demand that her daughter Lavinia be married to Turnus of the Rutuli. The Fury also led Ascanius, the son of Aeneas, to kill a deer sacred to the Rutuli during a hunt, and the scheme worked. Despite Aeneas's hopes of avoiding war, hostilities broke out between the Rutuli and the Trojans, sparking a long and merciless war that would ravage Latium. The Trojans, too few in numbers, sought allies. In a dream, Aeneas was encouraged to seek help from the Tuscans, enemies of the Rutuli, and their king Turnus. The Tuscans accepted to fight alongside the Trojans, as did a group of Greeks, the Arcadians, whom Aeneas met in the place where Rome would one day be founded, an area dominated by 7 hills at the time. The Rutuli had their own allies, namely Amazonian warriors, fearless women devoted to Diana and skilled in warfare, led by their leader Camilla. Venus was looking after her son as well. She asked her husband Vulcan, the god of craftsmen, to create weapons for Aeneas, which she then presented to her beloved son. Again, Juno was throwing her weight on the balance. She discreetly informed Turnus, the enemy king, that Aeneas was away from his camp and that the moment was ripe to attack the Trojans. Turnus led a raid on the camp, which he could breach the gates, but the Trojans had been toughened by years of adventures, and they could force the Rutuli king and his men to retreat. However, this clash was only a skirmish. The real battle was approaching, and it didn't take place in Latium. In the realm of gods, Juno and Venus passionately pleaded their cases before Jupiter, each side seeking the right to intervene or to have the gods settle the war in favor of their side. Jupiter decreed that Aeneas and the Trojans had, once again, proven their valor on their own, and the goddesses were to observe events without further interference. On the ground, Aeneas returned to his camp with the Tuscan and Arcadian allies, and a large-scale battle ensued. The battle was prolonged, with prominent warriors falling on both sides, and it concluded with an inconclusive truce to allow both sides to bury and honor their dead. As soon as the truce concluded, the battle resumed. The leader of the Amazons, Camilla, fell, but the battle's outcome remained unsolved. In an attempt to halt the bloodshed, a new truce emerged along with the idea of single combat. A duel between Aeneas and Turnus circulated. Aeneas was considered individually so superior to Turnus that the Rutuli knew their king wouldn't stand a chance. Consequently, they broke the truce again. Finally, Aeneas managed to force Turnus into a single combat, and the king of the Rutuli lost the fight. And this was most likely the end, as it was left unfinished. Some of the lines are incomplete, but there is no proper conclusion. However, the text certainly ends near the resolution Virgil intended. By winning the duel with Turnus, Aeneas granted victory to the Trojans and their allies, clearing the path for them to found their city in Latium. And on these foundations, the Roman kingdom, republic, and empire would flourish. Their descendants would include Romulus and Remus, and over the centuries, they would form the patrician families of ancient Rome, such as the gens Julia, the family of Julius Caesar and Augustus, his adoptive son. The merging of Italic people with the Trojans would create the Romans. These new people called to inhabit and rule from the most extraordinary city ever built. We've come to the end of our little journey tonight. I hope you enjoyed this adventure, and I invite you to discover and learn more. Now you can let go and sleep, or you may listen to another story from my library, like the Odyssey. And until we meet again, good night. Sleep well.